Yeah, so I wanted to do critical thinking as a topic because you and I had started kind of putting together some content material potentially. And I have been collecting kind of books on this subject for a long time. And I found when I was getting back into them, I had some like strong feelings about which ones were good and which ones were bad. So I brought a couple of examples that I think kind of illustrate that a little bit. But I just think the topic today is really essential, and especially for the generation that you are targeting, because just for the simple reason that there's so much information that they have to deal with. And we'll talk about like how we define critical thinking and what we see as the function of it. But yeah, like I can actually rant about this, and not even just like your audience, but the people I know that I'm close to. I feel like I've been trying to explain parts of this concept to them and why I take it so seriously, and I haven't done a good job of it. So I'm hoping to kind of use this platform to get the message out and like let them know where I kind of sit and why I think it's important to stay informed about some things. And yeah, that's kind of my approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, critical thinking obviously seems like it should be a baseline foundation of everybody's thought, but you start talking to people after a while and you start realizing, oh yeah, they're probably not thinking as critically as you'd want them to, right? Or as long as, I guess, maybe suboptimally, I guess maybe it's a better term.
Yeah, and I don't think that critical thinking is something that you necessarily deploy in all times and places. Something I wanted to talk about with you actually is because my approach is very much like assessing the truthfulness of claims, of when people say like, I think this is the case. That's when I kind of turn on and say, okay, now I need to assess this as being the case. Where I haven't used this very much is to say, how do I do this thing? And I feel like your engineering approach might help to kind of inform people who are more oriented towards the doing rather than just the thinking.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. We should talk about that.
Yeah,
if only we had a platform to do this on.
Yeah. Also, I'm very excited to do this in person.
Yeah, finally.
Yeah.
With a beer.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers. Time, man.
Yeah, this is about time. I wanted to kind of open and just ask like what you've been up to, because we haven't recorded in a couple weeks. So is there anything that you can kind of update people on or talk about what you're doing, or is it kind of hush hush still?
Yeah, well, I mean, the latest is kind of a culmination of all the efforts and experiments that I've been running over the past year, which is coming to fruition in terms of a program that I'm providing, which is what I'm calling, I guess, is part of the DTFC Academy, which is kind of an overall branch or division of the company. But the idea is that through that, we're going to offer something what I'm going to call the guaranteed job program, because basically I think it's kind of crazy that we have to pay so much tuition and not have a guaranteed job coming out of it, especially when the whole point is let's learn some education, let's learn some skills, let's develop those tools, and then there should be an application for it after, which is supposed to be the workforce. And it should logically make sense that you build these skills and then you go somewhere with it, right? But we're kind of getting sucked into paying this money, getting those skills, and then not even having an opportunity coming out of it. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I've been focusing on the last little while.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really good area to focus, because I think that part of that educational or like transition period for students is really frustrating when they kind of come to the realization that their investment is not going to pay out in the way that they necessarily expected. So do you want to talk about your kind of approach to addressing it, or should we just kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly, it's not complicated. It's just the idea is built around bridging the gap essentially from education to industry, right? And I'm sure you've seen it in the places that you've worked, and I've seen it in all the places that I've worked and all the companies that I've talked to and worked with in the past, is you bring students in or you bring people in at the entry level, and the majority of the time they're being trained on the job. Right. So at the end of the day, realistically, you're learning fundamentals and somewhat of a foundation in school. But as soon as we take you one step further to the application of what you actually need to do, it's something we have to retrain you for. And essentially from the company's perspective, that's an investment, right? Yeah. So their options are essentially invest in, they either have to give up time or money, right, in their investment. And they're either going to do that by hiring somebody who's more experienced, which is then going to cost them more, or they're going to have to be willing to invest the time and the money and resources into training somebody more junior that doesn't have that experience, but it's going to cost them a little bit less in terms of money. It's going to cost them a little bit more in terms of time, right? So they end up either way paying for that investment for you, which is also kind of interesting because you as a student are paying for your own investment of your tuition.
Yeah.
The company is now also paying their investment, and
nobody's getting what they want.
Exactly. Exactly. So like I'm trying to create this program that essentially bridges that gap. So what the idea is that students will come in and we'll give you some foundational basics or general training, which will teach you the things that I've recognized as pain points for most companies based on what students are missing when they are entering the workforce. Even I've worked with first-year students, fourth-year students, and they all seem to miss some certain key fundamentals.
Okay.
So the starting point is that, and then from there we'll go into more specific training based on either the industry that you're looking to get into or the specific field or a potential job that I might have that I'm lining you up for that will allow you to become more productive and more efficient right off the bat, right? Instead of hitting that like 3-month learning curve when you're doing a 4-month term, 3 out of 4 months learning is maybe it's necessary, but I'm trying to make the argument that maybe it's not.
Right.
So if we're going to spend some time investing into your development, we should probably invest some of that time so that we can reduce that 3 months maybe down to 1 month or a few weeks or whatever it is, right?
Gotcha.
So that the companies are able to leverage you and see the value that you can actually provide, which is a lot. And I mean, obviously everybody knows that because they're willing to hire younger talent, but they're not able to get that out of you. And especially with companies that are limited in the financial side or their ability to pay for resources, that becomes a lot more critical.
Right. Like they need you ready to go by the time you step in the door.
Basically, because otherwise, especially with startups or smaller companies, like they don't have the funds, right? They can't afford to be bringing in people that need to be trained, or because they're almost not necessarily paycheck to paycheck, but that's the kind of reference point, right?
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, that's a good way to deal with a lot of frustrations in that section of industry or the economy or whatever it is. I was just going to say, the experience that you brought up with kind of landing on the job and then needing to kind of train from the ground up was pretty much exactly what I experienced in my when I was first kind of hired to my first grown-up job. And it is a little bit, I think it's a little jarring from both perspectives. Yeah, like you kind of mentioned this already, but like internally from both sides, I feel like the students are a little bit shocked at how bad they are at what they're going to be doing from the beginning, and the employers are a little bit shocked at how hard the students are to change into someone that's going to be useful to them. So, and another point that just came to mind as you were talking to is that we talked in a few previous episodes about networking and about doing tasks or projects that you have some accountability for, so people can kind of give you that or vouch for you later on and say, yeah, this guy built something for me, and that separates him from the other candidates. So I feel like the more value people can kind of extract from those co-op experiences and the more time they can spend actually doing and not just learning how to do, the better off they'll be and the more kind of accomplishment they'll have for their resumes and things going forward.
Yeah, exactly. And all those things are all building blocks, right? You do have to do some projects or some of these things to help build your resume, but like you said, networking is such a key piece, and having somebody to be able to vouch for you, to say, okay, yeah, I've worked with this person, I know what they're capable of, and I've trained them up to this level or whatever, and their training is actually relevant to what you as a company is looking for. That's becomes almost a no-brainer for a lot of companies, right?
Yeah. And what has the response kind of been like from them?
So far it's been good.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's this is the interesting part is you talk to some of these recruiters or people that are working in HR in certain companies, and they all understand that these are the problems, right?
Okay.
But I guess there's not a lot of good solutions out there to solve it. They just everyone's just kind of willing to take the hit to make the play kind of thing, right?
Right.
Whereas I'm thinking maybe it doesn't have to be like this, right? Maybe we can find a better solution.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess we don't want to get, this kind of seems like a good segue. Obviously there's certain things that you've identified as problem areas for students transitioning into pseudo workplace experiences or co-op type experiences. So maybe bring up a couple of those and then tell us how critical thinking kind of fits into that picture.
So what are you thinking exactly? Like an example of yes, and I am not. So
the students come in, they have like a year or two of academic education, and now they're trying to get into a company for a few months as a co-op and also be productive. So what is the gap and how are you kind of filling it?
Okay, so like let's take software for as an example, right? So there's ton of students either in computer science programs or software engineering or electrical engineering or arguably any level of engineering. They get some programming level courses, right? Okay. But you take it to the level of going to work at a company. What do they actually need to understand? And sure, they may have written a program or they may have followed a tutorial or did some classes, but that doesn't necessarily translate directly to what they're going to have to do. Mm-hmm. Because the problem with a lot of those things is they get to start from scratch. And in the real world, you don't get to start from scratch. You have to start from somewhere. This already exists. It's like, okay, we already have a design or we already have a program and we have to redesign it or we have to update it or we have to add one feature to it. So you have to walk in, start understanding what code they've already developed, not understanding it at all in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then be able to read their code. And then on top of that, help them develop this new thing that's going to fit into what's already existing, despite the fact that you don't know the new thing and you don't know what already exists.
Right. And that puts you in the position you're talking about where you're basically useless at the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And useless is a strong word, yeah. but okay, sure. In terms of like productivity, yeah, you could argue that, right? And the point is, well, what skills are you missing now that arguably you should have been taught in school, but you were taught maybe the programming language or you were taught the fundamentals or data structures or the specific algorithms. But the question is that actually what you need to be able to jump in on this project as quickly as possible? And I think the argument from a lot of companies or a lot of people I've talked to is not necessarily, right? You need to understand the fundamentals, maybe to read the code. I mean, for sure, that's going to help. But I mean, honestly, I'm not a software guy by primary background, mm-hmm. but I can read most code. And it's just because I understand the fundamentals of what it takes to write an if statement.
Right. And across languages, that's pretty consistent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's certain things. And I mean, obviously there's all sorts of different nuances to everything. And I'm sure if you ask a software guy, they're going to smack me in the face for mentioning any of these things. But
we'll do that next.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Stay tuned.
Phone a friend.
But yeah, I mean, I guess the point is that these guys need a real world scenario, a real application, and something that's already existing to really give themselves that scenario to say, okay, this is already existing. Now let's try and build something on top of that. Right. So part of what we're offering as well is just opportunities to work on those kinds of projects, right? And I mean, software is just one specific field or area. We could apply this concept though to every other area, right?
Nice. And you mean beyond engineering even?
Beyond engineering. Well, I was going to ask you actually, like, how do you think that concept ties into like your industry or what you've seen? Like, does that seem like an applicable or parallel thing like that you've seen as well, or?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I almost feel like one of the projects I've been working on recently, which is kind of developing an up-to-date like training module for new people coming in, has been like my kind of target goals for that project have been the exact problems that you're talking about. And it's like we started years and years ago. We'd kind of bring in what we call like juniors or like junior underwriters, and we put them through like a university, and it was weeks long. And there was like a specialist who'd kind of come in and talk about each part of things, and like somebody had to commit their time to like spending the whole day and like answering all the questions and creating like a classroom type environment. And the learning curve after that kind of training to become like properly competent at the job was about 3 to 4 years at that time. So when you talk about like maybe useless was a strong word, but it's funny now, like shifting to our current time, we have people like leaving veteran roles and we're hiring younger juniors to kind of fill in the gaps there. But there's such a time lag. So it's like those juniors aren't going to be filling the shoes of the veterans for years. So the question was, that was kind of costing a lot of people time and effort. And that was a little bit recognized, and there was a decision made at some point to just stop doing that. So the solution was, let's just get them to do the job and then they'll ask questions and figure it out as they go. which philosophically I think kind of aligns with what you're kind of doing, but it also was not effective for its own reasons. There are some parts of the job that you just kind of have to sit back and think about and understand, because there's too many things coming at you, at least in this particular role, from too many different directions to learn at once. Is a little bit overwhelming. And it does free up the time for the trainers a little bit, but a lot of the beginning, at least for me and other people hired around when I was hired, was sit down and read these like pages and pages of documents and procedures so that you know what you're doing. It's like, okay, what's the balance between reading pages and pages of procedures and having someone teach me for 3 weeks? And so we ended up going with this kind of digital software where we would take all of the documents that they had to learn and kind of sift them down into the key points that you need to know at the beginning, and then present them digitally, and then kind of test people as they go to make sure they're actually retaining things. So yeah, it's funny like when you talk about what you're doing, because I feel like that's kind of implicitly been the goal. Like I haven't worded it the same way that you're kind of wording it. It's more like we need these people to be ready to do real life cases as soon as possible, but also be oriented at a broader level in the right direction as they're doing that. Because you can be really good at like knowing where to click and like how to get like processing things and pushing them through. But when it's time to make a difficult decision about, this guy's mortality is a little bit fringy, or like, fringy is a terrible word. Fringe mortality. No, this guy's like, it could go this way or that way, and people are pressuring me to go this way, and the company wants to go this way, so what do I do? That's kind of, as things become more and more automated, what your skill set is. It's making judgments. And if you aren't making the correct background assumptions about, like, as you're working through those judgments, then you're just going to be building up a series of decisions that aren't kind of aligned with the department and with the company. So a big part of my thing, and actually I think this ties into what we're going to talk about today really well, is setting those background assumptions and saying like, look, like, and even the training that we did before was not aligned this way. It's like, do you even know where you are? Because when I joined the company, I was like, oh yeah, we like sell insurance. And people are like, yeah, I mean, we kind of do that. We kind of do some other things. And I was like, what do you mean we do some other things? Like, and it wasn't until years later that I was like, okay, let me look into some of this other stuff.
Yeah.
And like we had kind of an investors day, sorry, long rant, the other day where our CEO presented to some people. And he basically said like, our main value in the next 5 years is going to come from China, by the way. And I think half the company operates without even realizing that. And I think, so when I set out to my first module, I was like, hey, like, welcome to the company. This is what we do. Like, these are the key people. You should probably know who they are. So if they send you an email, like, get on top of that. And that was not something that I had. And I'm hoping that kind of sets them up to be like, yeah, to just kind of know where they are. And like, I think orientation is a big word. We'll talk about when we get into the critical thinking, but I don't think you can critical think until you've made the right background assumptions. Or at least you kind of, again, going to get into this more, but until you kind of know where you stand and what your objectives are.
Right.
And we had never had a formalized way of communicating that until this. So, and I don't think I did a great job at it. It's better than nothing right now, but it's kind of like an iterative process. So.
Well, so I mean, I guess to jump onto that point there, it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like, sounds like you're just trying to define your objectives, meaning like your vision, right? And that's like company vision or department vision or whatever it is, right? But I think that's just a general point for like any process, right? So that's why that fits in really well. Right?
Yeah, it is a general point, and like you should kind of know where your role fits in with the overall strategy of the organization that you're working in. But I also think that for people with technical roles, that's often optional. Like if you're really good at your technical role and right. you're fulfilling the requirements that are being set out for you, maybe you don't have to think about the broader thing.
Yep.
But we're finding that people are not thinking about the broader thing until something happens, and then they have to, and then they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Or they're calling people and now they're wasting somebody else's time being like, hey, what is our approach here? And it's like, you should know this. Like, not that you should know this off the top of your head, but you should be able to deduce it based on what you know about our direction and our philosophy. And that kind of thinking is not there right now.
Yeah, which is an interesting point too, because I think that there's a struggle with that. And I wouldn't even say that it's just new people coming in, unless, okay, new people, you mean like anybody at any level coming in that's new, or younger, like entry level?
That's a really good question. I mean entry level.
Okay.
That's primarily been my target right now, but there definitely is, we definitely have philosophies that differ from our competitors. So when people who are experienced come over to us, they do need a realignment.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't done a good job of measuring that gap yet, but that is definitely a different approach. Yeah.
Okay. Because I was going to, I guess the point I was going to make is that I used to divide, or I still kind of do, but I try and divide people into categories when I'm trying to understand like how they operate and how they work so that I can work well with them, right? And one of the divisions that I usually make is detail-oriented versus big picture, right? And when you start working with a lot of engineers or a lot of technical people, like you see the detail-oriented part like through and through all the time, right? And that's not just an entry-level thing, like that persists forever, right? If those people are detail-oriented, and I mean, for good reason, like that's their job, right?
Yeah.
Especially coming from a background working at BlackBerry or one of these huge corporations, like you're paid to be a subject matter expert in that one area, and that's your job. So it's not really your job anymore to worry about the bigger picture. Project managers or execs or people at that level that are figuring that stuff out, and then they trickle down the individual tasks or individual areas that they need support in.
Right.
And you as a subject matter expert, you focus on that area, and it's not really relevant to you to worry about the rest of it. Though, I mean, I'm sure everyone would argue it's good to have a good picture vision of what's going on.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why some of those companies fail and they don't really keep innovating, because those people are just so focused on this one little task and they start to miss the big picture. So I get it from both sides.
Yeah, I wonder if that's true. And I think, I do think at the technical level, it's still important, even from like a selfish personal perspective, to know what you're contributing at the broader level. Because if you are now going to interview somewhere different or look to make a move in your career, how are you going to explain what your contribution was if it was just, I kind of did my job the way that I was told to do it? And I fall into this trap all the time. Like my role is kind of isolated, and I kind of report to people when I need guidance, but otherwise I kind of just sit down and do my work. And it's very easy to sit there and just do the work and not really constantly kind of criticize yourself or like think about what your context is or think about where you're trying to go. And I think we had two really good examples with Dan and Jeremy of like in our last two episodes of people who were excellent at articulating where they were. And I would say that at least that contributed a lot to their interviewing, if not their overall success.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, does critical thinking fit into this picture? Like, let's transition into this topic a little bit. We're already 23 minutes in. I'm kind of impressed.
I thought we were already talking about critical thinking because I was ready to tie it in already. Because at the end of the day, I think that's the biggest problem, is that people at any level are getting stuck just focusing on, and I see this all the time with students, is they don't really want to care, or at least some of them don't want to care about like, what are we trying to do? It's like, okay, or like, why are we trying to do it? It's like, what are we trying to do? Let's just do that.
Yeah.
And it's more like task driven, or they think, and I mean, maybe they're being led this way because that's what shows up on their resume. It's like, okay, what did you do? And what was your output? And how did that benefit somebody?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, great. But why did you even do that in the first place? It's like, I don't know.
Somebody told me to.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Which maybe is okay in the beginning, but it really isn't okay. Right. And that's the critical thinking piece that I think a lot of them are missing, that hopefully is going to tie into the topic here. Right.
Yeah. And so something that I kind of like fault myself on, like I take the critical thinking stuff very seriously, but I often find when I'm trying to explain it to someone else, I'm not always good at saying, like, especially, not that I necessarily have encountered a lot of people like this, but if you did talk to someone who just had no conception of it and was like, yeah, I don't really think twice about my decisions, but everything's worked out fine so far, why should I start critical thinking now? So I don't know, maybe you can give a couple of examples of like even those students who are kind of building up their resume with projects and tasks that they're not really thinking more broadly about. When is that going to come back to bite them?
Well, so maybe I'll make the argument for them first.
Okay, sure.
Because I think that's maybe to give them a leg to stand on, right?
Yeah, let's see what we're up against.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I think and this is like, okay, this is the paradox world that is so frustrating and confusing to be in, but it's the world that we live in, right? Everything is a paradox, right?
Yeah, okay.
So it's like, we're going to do a whole session, like a 6-hour podcast on that one.
I literally bought a book on paradoxes once you started bringing this up, because
Yeah.
that's my instinct to do all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like more advanced than I realized. It's like strictly a logic book and just a bunch of symbols and like hieroglyphics.
Yeah.
So I was like, fuck. But we'll see if it has any useful input on your paradox world.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe say what you mean by that, because I've heard you talk about it before, but people listening.
So like a paradox is essentially a situation where you have two options, or so maybe this is a practical explanation of a paradox. I actually don't even know if this is a definition or not.
Sure, whatever.
This is my definition as of right now today.
The DTFC definition.
DTFC definition, exactly. So the paradox is when you have a situation, or maybe I'll give this as the example of this, when the paradox shows up, right?
Okay.
So earlier this year, I was working on a model that I thought was going to work, and I had invested an amount of time and resources and whatever into that model, right? I started measuring or testing and measuring and testing and measuring, and I started getting results back that were suggesting this is not the best model.
Okay.
Now, what should I do, right? And the question is, okay, should I give up and move to adjust to a new model? Or should I be resilient and stick it out because maybe there's enough benefit coming out of this that I can eventually push this along and it'll get somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Now, those are two opposite forces, right? Should I give up or should I be resilient and stick with it? Right? Now, which one should I do? And when you start making the arguments either way, you can make a very reasonable argument either way.
Yeah.
And you talk to one person, they'll say, no, you should dump this model. You've spent enough time on it. Go try something else, right? Because this is clearly not working. And you talk to somebody else and say, you know what, maybe you should stick with it because you haven't put enough time into it yet. And sure, maybe it's not going so well yet, but there's enough good things that there's something you could probably get out of it if you keep going with it. Okay. Right? Like, that's the paradox.
Right, and you can't do one and the other at the same time.
Exactly.
Well, not well, anyway.
Not well, yeah, exactly. It's probably inefficient to try and sit somewhere in the middle, right?
Right.
So that's the paradox.
Okay, this it kind of reminds me of companies kind of choosing to ride out their cash cow type of product lines, or actually continuously invest in innovation and try to prepare themselves to find more of those kind of opportunities in the future. And I probably could name off the top of my head, although I wouldn't be able to go into many details, a couple of companies that were just really slow to do that and failed as a result. So, yeah. That's what it sounds like you're going through at a personal level.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so honestly, I forgot what was the original application that we were going to talk about.
We were trying to reinforce the argument for the technical person just sticking to their technical role. And say like, okay, what is the appeal of doing that?
Right.
Yeah. And then Paradox World happened and we had to break that down.
Right, exactly, yeah. Okay, so sticking to that paradox, right?
Yeah.
So there's the argument that we should critically think because that's going to give us optimal results or that's going to be efficient. The other side of that is evident probably in many other places. For example, I don't think at all about breathing.
There you go, okay.
Or sleeping or walking. And my body does it as efficiently as possible. And if I thought about it, I'd probably do it worse.
Right. It's the centipede learning to walk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So there's clearly can be an argument to not critically think. And I think that's the crazy part or the interesting part, whichever way you want to think about it, is that the way the generation now, or that the world that we live in now, we are offered so many opportunities to have things efficiently done for us. Like we have the internet, which is a crazy concept 20 years ago. Like being able to say that, we just watch videos on our phones. Back with when we had Motorola phones or whatever, random flip phones, like they're like,
God,
good luck
Motorola.
with that, man. We're going to the movie theater. Okay? Don't be stupid. We're not watching anything on our phones.
I remember it's funny because I had that conversation with Jeremy about whether we'd ever be mobily watching videos, and I had a PSP at the time, and I was like, this thing's a piece of shit. This is never going to happen at the pace that it's happening now. And he's like, nah, it's probably going to happen. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
It's not. And I was very wrong.
Yeah.
Critical thinking means admitting when you were wrong.
There you go. Exactly. That's definitely a key point.
Anyway, yeah.
But yeah, so I think there is definitely a case for not critically thinking. But this is the paradox, and this is why everything is so confusing, is because there is a very reasonable argument most of the time each way. And I mean, this kind of ties into like some other discussions that I've been having with other people about right and wrong or black and white or stuff like that I probably shouldn't be talking about now. But
deep shit, we're going to cut that, don't worry.
Like, I mean, this is what critical thinking gets you, right? And I think the point that I'm trying to make there is that the easiest example that I can give is the stock market.
Okay.
Right? Which basically the idea is if you're picking a stock to invest in, you're predicting that stock's going to go up or down. Right. And the point is you're trying to make that prediction as reliably as you can. So you might get some information, you might burp on the audio.
I was trying to ignore it. Oh, this is hitting me harder than I expected. Maybe the vaccine and the beer at the same time are not a good, I don't know.
We can do some studies on that.
We will think critically about this.
Feel free to phone in if you've had a vaccine and a beer on the same day.
On the same day. Call now.
Yeah, please call now. 555-5555.
How'd you know my number?
So basically, when we're looking at the stock market from an investing perspective, you're trying to pick a stock that's going to go up or down next. And the whole point is that it doesn't really matter what has happened previously.
Right. Past performance is no guarantee of future returns.
It's no guarantee. It might indicate certain things, might help you to figure out, okay, if this has happened 1,000 times in the past and 90% of the time it went up next. It's like, okay, that could be a good indication that we should use this. Maybe it's somewhat reliable.
You mean beyond one company, right? You're talking about a technical pattern?
Sure. Yeah, okay. Exactly. Like whatever signal you're using, and it doesn't necessarily matter what that is.
Okay.
Right? It's some signal that's suggesting that every time that signal appears, 9 times out of 10, the stock or the market or whatever it is that you're predicting goes in a certain direction.
Okay.
Right? So you're now trying to use that as an indicator or a signal to help you make a future decision. Right? Now, how do we tie that back to critical thinking? I guess the point is we want to try and predict the future, and that's the whole point of critical thinking, right? Like we're trying to make decisions on things that are going to happen that we don't know about, right? Either relating to business or our technical implementation of a design, something like that, right? It could be as complicated or as simple as you want, but the point is we're trying to make decisions based off of information that we have. So the question, though, then relating back to critical thinking is, if we were right 9 times out of 10 on those 1,000 times, should we not now find any more information?
Right. It's working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Now, should we throw critical thinking out the door because we already have a result or a potential result based on some past history that suggests don't waste or don't invest any more time trying to find more information because we already have a 90% success rate. Mm-hmm. So let's just keep doing that until maybe 90 drops down to 80 or 70 or whatever other number you want to pick. But that's a fairly reasonable reason to not critically think. Right. Now, I think the challenge with that is that I don't think we truly understand the 9 times out of 10 that is happening, and I don't think we ever have enough sample points to make that argument strong.
And it only takes one. Like I can definitely tie this into a booklet after you're done going on your point. But
yeah,
what I just wanted to confirm with that is like you can be right. Again, you use 9 out of 10, but you can be right 999 times. But if you're wrong once in a significant way, that can definitely be a big challenge to the patterns that you were following those first few times. Yeah. But anyway, let me just take this on because I feel like one of the earliest kind of books I read about this kind of thing, and I think the stock market is the same example in the book and is a fantastic example overall of an area where people very much struggle to think critically. We were kind of lucky that the resources that we used initially to learn about this stuff were very critical. And I think kind of pushed us in that direction, didn't say like, use this one technique all the time and you'll be fine. It was very much like, hey, you're an idiot if you're not thinking about these 10 different things. And that eventually just pushed me out of the market. I was like, I'm too much of an idiot. But no, I think that's the right approach. But I think the book that I'm thinking of here is called Fooled by Randomness, and it's by Nazim Taleb, who's a very famous author of The Black Swan. And his point at the beginning of the book was he positions two investors, and I think there's a little bit of biography kind of written into his story because his claim to fame is basically being right when other people were wrong. But his point is that a bull market, it's very easy to make money in a bull market. And it's very easy to think that the money that you're making is the result of your excellent judgment or decision making. But if you're not, again, thinking critically, if you're not looking at the broader context and realizing at this point every idiot's making money, regardless of their level of expertise, you're not going to equip yourself to either preserve that money or continue making it when the market turns, right? And I think this kind of ties into your point, and something that I often consider a trigger for critical thinking is something has to go wrong. And this is something I might bring up later, but there's this concept that I heard in a podcast recently that like the title of the guy's book was The Revenge of the Real, and the concept very broadly was like you can build up a perception of reality that works for you for as long as you want, but reality will come back to bite you eventually. So you kind of have an implicit interest on creating a model of reality that is accurate, because if it's not, that will come back to bite you. And that really like hit home for me, because I was like, how do I explain this to people in exactly your scenario who are just riding a wave and having a lot of success, and they're like, why are you doing all this work? Like, why are you even thinking about it? Just do what I'm doing. And especially today in the financial world, there's at least like 2-3 very easy examples we might not want to pick on for a controversial reason.
I want to pick on them.
I want to too.
I thought that's why we're here.
I'm going to do a project on one of them pretty soon, so we can talk a little more about it maybe when I'm a little more informed.
Is it Bitcoin?
No, it's Tesla.
Oh, okay. Because we could do both. Like, can I do Bitcoin now, or like no? Well, maybe we'll save it.
You do whatever you want, man. You do you.
I just want to rip on all these Bitcoin geniuses.
I know. On my last show, I interviewed 4 MBA students, and I asked them for their read on Tesla, and I don't know what they'd all say today if I played that recording back for them. I know that they had a few varying opinions, and their justifications were a little bit scattered, but they were kind of earlier in their program now that they're at the end and they're cynical and they're like, the world is a broken place. I think they might have different opinions. So I hate saying this word, but my partner, Alex, like, wants to be on the show, and I think her and I are both doing risk projects on Tesla in the near future. So we should have a good read on like what investors who have been successful following that kind of stock in recent history should be aware of in terms of where, and that relates to Bitcoin too, in terms of where their income flow is actually coming from. But a subject to return to, I think.
Yeah.
I mean,
mean,
maybe Sinan should be here.
I was just going to say.
Sinan, we love you. But just be careful.
But you're going down.
I'm happy you bought a Tesla with your Bitcoin money, because that's like the combination of the worst things in the world.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah.
But
yeah.
I honestly want Sinan to be fantastically successful in life, so I don't really care how.
I think he's already there.
So. He's already there. Yeah.
Okay. He doesn't have to make podcasts, and it's like.
Yeah. Okay. So no, again, I do like what we're doing here. Do you think we've made the case yet? Like, I think you used the kind of autonomous breathing examples to say, like, look, there's some things that you don't really want to think that closely about. Just kind of go ahead and do them. And I actually think that makes an argument, like, I think that is compelling, but I think that the takeaway from that is that you should use critical thinking selectively. And that's one of the messages that I kind of want to deliver when we get fully into the topic too, is that no one is under the expectation that you're going to think perfectly critically in every scenario. And you should not operate under that intention either. Mm-hmm. But what you should be able to do is deploy that skill set where you deem it necessary. And I think that if you throw your hands up in the air and you say, the world will take sufficient care of me that I'll never have to deploy those skills, or so rarely that I'll never actually get good at doing it, I think that's when you get into putting yourself in a pretty precarious position, where once things do turn, you're going to find that you're not prepared for what was coming.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. I think the only wrench that I can throw in there is that you might have to be good at critical thinking to know when you should be critically thinking.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, no,
I'm okay with that too.
Yeah,
I think that's just the problem, is that you don't have the critical thinking skill to think about when you should critically think.
Yeah, it's like a chicken and egg thing,
exactly,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
But you know what? I don't even think, like, I don't know if the scenarios necessarily beg to be thought about individually. Like, I think it really is, you know what? Okay, this is what I think we should do. Let's finish talking about the technical guy, and then we can take a break, and then we can get fully into the subject. Because I feel like I've said like 6 times in the first segment, like, yeah, we're going to get to this, and now I'm like, we've got to dedicate some time to getting to it. So,
okay. So what's the technical guy?
The technical guy, let's go back to the job site, because I think we kind of left that environment. We went to the stock market. Mm-hmm. But you have your technical guy on site who is doing a really good job at his technical role. He's being adequately rewarded for his proficiency in that technical role. Doesn't really know what his company does. Like, my brother is an accountant, and I know he does a ton of work for the company that he works for, and he brings the checks to the bank, and they say, how's the business? And he says, how the fuck do I know? Let me just cash the check so I can go home. So, like, what do you say to that person who is otherwise being successful? Right. Yeah, like, why should they expend the extra effort?
Well, I mean, that's the question, right? Should they or shouldn't they?
Yeah,
And I think to tie it back to one of your points before, which is it depends if you really care about the vision, right? Is there a reason for you to care about the bigger picture? And if there isn't, and maybe there isn't, then don't worry about it, right?
Okay.
But I think to tie it to...
How big is the big picture that you're talking about? Is it big picture like company scope or broader than that?
It could be either, right?
Okay.
But I think when we're talking about the technical guy that is tunnel vision on whatever he's doing, he's not thinking about either of those.
Okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
So I guess the question is, for if we're going to tie it to the student population, is, well, what should they be caring about bigger picture? And the interesting part is that, especially with the generation now, a lot of them have these big dreams. Right? Like, they want to run companies or do entrepreneurship or solve world hunger or all these great things that, like, yes, they should be going to figure out and how to do all those things. And those are all big picture items. But now they're not thinking critically about all the things that they're doing, and they're getting stuck now into this, like, I guess, quote unquote, technical guy world where, they're not thinking about, okay, well, sure, you have this big dream and vision, but how are you going to get there?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what were the people who are doing that now doing at your age? Not necessarily age, but like at your career kind of stage.
When I was at that?
No, I just mean like if someone says to you, yeah, I'm going to be the owner of this big company in the future, and you say, okay, like, this is your current position. These are some owners of those companies now. This is what they were doing, like, kind of thinking backwards from the target destination.
And you're asking, like, what they should be thinking?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, like, if you're really stuck in your, like, narrow technical mindset, and you have this goal to, like, that's not going to build up to becoming the owner of a giant company. Right. I mean, maybe it could. I don't know if you made a few changes, but yeah.
Okay, and I think the challenge is that there's no clear path, and we're getting constantly influenced by all these different things telling us, well, you can do whatever you want, and no path is the right path, you can do anything. And it's like, oh, wow, that's great.
Just be yourself.
Exactly. Be yourself, right? Like,
be your drone worker self.
Exactly. Be authentic is my favorite line. It's like, but what if my authentic self sucks?
Oh man,
that's a whole other podcast. Yeah. We don't even have time for that one.
No, we probably should. But that phrase irks me greatly.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the mentality that we're getting told constantly. It's like, well, you can do this, right? And yes, they're right, and that's the tricky part. It's like, they're right about, like, key certain statements that they say, and the rest of it, if we were to critically analyze their statement or their message to us, is like, okay, you were right about, like, 1 out of 10 things that you told me.
Okay.
But because I liked that one thing that you told me, I assumed that the other 9 things also tie in and follow the same format.
Okay, that's interesting. Sorry, can you kind of set that into, like, a particular, like an example?
Yeah, so I think this is basically, like, the concept is basically confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Right? So I have a thought, and I'm saying, okay, I should go into this field because there's a lot of jobs in that field.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so that's my starting point. So and I talked to a person, and they told me the same thing. And then I talked to another person, and they told me the same thing. And then I talked to a student in my class, and they told me the same thing. Now, the first 2 people I talked to were in the industry. And one was a CEO, one was a technical person, and they both told me the same thing. And now I talked to a student or a friend of mine in my class, and they also told me that same thing.
Okay.
However, they told me 9 other things. And all 10 things, they have no experience or no background in.
Right.
But they gave me the advice. And that first point of advice correlated with the other 2 pieces of advice that might have had some validity to it. But now I'm just tying them together and saying, okay, well, these 2 really smart people that are successful told me this thing. And then my buddy, who also told me the same thing, it lines up.
Right.
So he must know what he's talking about.
Let's just go back to my buddy for future
him.
advice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I should let him look at my resume. I should let him tell me how to apply to jobs, or what jobs I should apply to, or who I should talk to. It's like, hold on.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Blind squirrel, my friend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I think we've covered a lot so far. I think we're getting a little bit excited and kind of jumping around from context to context. I think, I hope the people who are maybe less supportive or interested in the critical thinking topic, although I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, fuck critical thinking. They're like, I'm not about critical thinking and I don't want to be.
Are you asking me to say that for argument's sake?
No, I don't want to be on the opposite side of you on this issue. But I do think, actually one of the books I have here, one of the steps, it gives you kind of some red flags to say, like, some reasons to believe you might not be a critical thinker. And one of the top ones is, like, you tell people you're a critical thinker. So I do think that it does go a little bit further than just kind of claiming this identity or this kind of commitment and not following through on specific behaviors. But
yeah.
I hope anyone who kind of isn't convinced about the concept is convinced that was a confusing sentence. I hope anyone who isn't kind of feeling enthusiastic about the concept is convinced that we've done them the justice of kind of positioning them so that we can now beat them down for the next half of the show, I guess. We'll see.
So too.
We might lose the argument to ourselves. It wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah.
So, okay, we'll take a quick break and stretch and let the vaccine run through our systems and alcohol and such things, and then we'll come back.
Sounds good.